to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous series of lectures, we talked about political changes during the age of Jackson and economic changes, the evolution of the market economy over that same period. In this series of lectures, we're going to be talking about social and cultural changes related to those political and economic changes. In this first lecture, we're going to be talking about revivalism and reform in the age of Jackson. The economic and political changes we've discussed in previous lectures led many Americans by the mid-19th century to believe that various aspects of our society needed to be reformed and improved, particularly areas involving America's morality, crime in the cities, prostitution, alcohol and consumption, and just generally ill behaviors, led many to believe we needed to improve our situation in the country. For many, this came in the form of a revived and more enthusiastic commitment to religion. A revivalist movement we know as the Second Great Awakening originated in the late 1790s and lasted through the 1820s or 30s. This was similar to the First Great Awakening that we discussed from back in the 1730s and 40s, but was larger in scale and had more sweeping effects across the country. The Second Great Awakening manifested itself in the form of camp meetings that often involved many different religious sects, black and white, men and women. These meetings were often filled with political and social overtones. They were political because they called for democracy within religion and its actions, and social because they often became linked to social reforms. By the early 1800s, religious revivalism would occur in these camp meetings where hundreds or even thousands of people might gather, and sometimes dozens of preachers speaking at a time. For the people in that era, this would have been akin to a rock group or a rock concert arriving in town. It was met with huge crowds, wild enthusiasm, and great spectacle. And you see here up on the stage a whole group of preachers, 5 or 6 of them up there, speaking to crowds of hundreds of people. And you might notice within this crowd there are women and children in addition to men. One of the leading figures of the Second Great Awakening was a man named Charles Grandison Finney, who was a lawyer who became a preacher after having a religious conversion experience one day. And he adopted into his sermons the style of a courtroom lawyer, depicting everything in terms of a civil case and appealing to the jury in the audience. He emphasized positive behavior rather than the idea of condemning people to eternal damnation. Sobriety, hard work, and so on would lead to success in life. And this mission found broad appeal among his audiences. Here is the description of one man named James Finley who attended one of these camp meetings. The noise was like the roar of Niagara. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as if by a storm. I counted 7 ministers, all preaching at one time, some on stumps, others on wagons. Some of the people were singing, others praying, some crying for mercy. A peculiarly strange sensation came over me. My heart beat tumultuously, my knees trembled, my lips quivered, and I felt as though I must fall to the ground. And so again, just imagine what kind of things in life at that time would have brought that kind of excitement and noise to a community. The Second Great Awakening, unlike the first, also extended to blacks and women as well. Blacks took solace in the visions of God delivered in these new sermons. God as a warrior who had freed the Jews from slavery. These stories gave them hope. They were also drawn to the democratic visions of religion as portrayed by these evangelical preachers. We are all equal in the eyes of the Lord, black and white. The Second Great Awakening also appealed to women. Women's roles expanded as they participated more actively in the church. Women formed their own religious societies and were active in the various reform movements that we're going to be discussing a little bit later. They also contributed to the organization and leadership of charitable organizations. Also, in the tradition of many congregations of evangelical churches, men and women would be separated in the pews, but not so under the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening called for gender equality in the church as well. As one minister said, "Our prayer meetings have been one of the greatest means of conversion of the souls, especially those in which brothers and sisters have prayed together." Women also helped to keep the finances and books in their churches, and also became public teachers in the public schools. Again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. So it's in this era that teaching becomes one of the major professions available to women. The Second Great Awakening also lent itself well to the idea of social reform. As the itinerant ministers traveled around giving their sermons, it was convenient for them to target various social ills and address those in their sermons. One of the most obvious that was the subject of much reform in this era was temperance, the movement against drinking. As one pamphlet noted, "Drink is the prolific source of nearly all the ills that afflict the human family." So much of the violence or poverty that were experienced during this period might be avoided with the absence of drinking. This movement did have some effect in reducing the amount of alcohol consumed by Americans. And eventually, as many of you know, these ideas would be revived in the 20th century when the nation enacted prohibition for a time in the 1920s. The temperance movement gained considerable momentum in the country during the 1820s and 30s. The first national temperance organization was founded in 1826, and by the mid-1830s, there were more than 1.5 million members around the country, and some 2 million Americans had taken vows of abstinence from alcohol. In its extreme form, the temperance movement called for the absolute prohibition of alcohol, and in some states they were successful in passing laws prohibiting alcohol. The most severe in Maine in 1851, which prohibited alcohol altogether. But nearly half of the states in the country had some kind of laws regarding alcohol consumption by the mid-1800s. Reformers in this era took up a host of causes. One of them was education. As Lyman Beecher wrote, "We must educate, or we must perish by our own prosperity." One of the leaders in the movement for education reform was Horace Mann, a Massachusetts legislator. He worked on improving the state's education curriculum and helped to push through the first compulsory school attendance law in the country, in Massachusetts at that time. In Mann's view, education was preventative. That is, the more education children got, the less likely they were to fall into trouble with some of the other social ills that were targeted by reform. Believe it or not, the movement to improve public schools actually encountered quite a bit of opposition from various groups in the country. Farmers, for one, were concerned that their children would then be called away from the farm and not be able to contribute as much work as they had. Other groups worried about political motivations in the schools and what exactly their children would be taught. And others were concerned about the taxes they would be forced to pay to cover these improvements in the schools. Nonetheless, public education and higher education expanded dramatically in the years under discussion. For example, in 1815, there were 33 colleges in America. By 1848, there were 113. So education during this era underwent a huge boom. Finally, there were those who sought to reform conditions in prisons and asylums in the country, which in most cases were abhorrible beyond our ability to comprehend in the present day. There were none of the kind of humanitarian considerations in early prisons and asylums that we're familiar with now. Some oppose the idea of imprisonment altogether. The sort of Enlightenment emphasis on free will and idealism ran counter to the idea of locking anyone up in prison at all. But most were more concerned with the conditions in the prisons and asylums and the methods that were employed in caring for, or in some cases abusing, the inmates in these institutions. One of the most famous of these reformers was Dorothea Dix, who as a young child had been subject to child abuse herself and thus grew up with her grandmother in Boston. At that time, she attended school and then eventually went over to Europe and examined education along with prisons and asylums in Europe. When she returned to the United States, she had a different view of the way that inmates in prisons and asylums could be cared for and even rehabilitated and improved and returned to society. Dix toured the countryside, exploring prisons and asylums and writing about what she saw. In one case, she wrote, "Persons were confined in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." These kind of eye-opening descriptions of prisoners and inmates in asylums often had an effect on the politicians that she appealed to. While change was slow and difficult to achieve in this period, Dix is something of a forerunner of a generation of journalists to come later in the late 1800s and early 1900s that we know as muckrakers, investigative journalists who led to significant changes in many kinds of institutions. As a footnote to our discussion about Dorothea Dix, she went on to become one of the foremost nurses during the Civil War, celebrated for her care of both Union and Confederate soldiers during that war. So we will mention her again in a later lecture. In our next lecture, we turn to reform of perhaps the nation's most notorious institution, that of slavery.